This episode of Doc Talk is sponsored by the Cancer Institute at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. As the largest single provider of cancer care in the region, the Cancer Institute at the University of Tennessee Medical Center offers a broad spectrum of cancer specialists and services to care for patients and their families, from prevention and early detection to treatment and survivorship. The Cancer Institute is here for you.
Hi, welcome to Doc Talk. Doc Talk is the podcast put out by the Knoxville Academy of Medicine, which talks about health issues affecting all East Tennesseans in plain language. Welcome. I'm Elise Denaney, former president of the Knoxville Academy of Medicine, and I am so privileged, honored, and happy to welcome. Joining us today is Dr. John Bell. He's the director of the University of Tennessee Medical Center, Knoxville Cancer Center of Excellence. And if we have any question at all about cancer, this is the man to ask. So welcome, Dr. John Bell.
Thank you, Dr. Denaney. Thank you. I'm fine. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for asking me.
No, thank you for taking the time out to be here. Cancer is a scary thing. It's scary.
Yes.
I think a lot of times I'm always very concerned about telling a patient you have a tumor, and because it raises all sorts of red flags. Let's just start from basics, okay? So cancer is?
So cancer is uncontrolled growth of cells that most of the time were normal at some point in time. So it's the fact that these cells that had a normal lifestyle, in other words, they were born, all our cells in our body have finite lifespans, and different ones have different lifespans. You know, our hair grows, cut it off, grows back, things like that. And new ones come in their place. And then the topic for today is all this issue of genetics and what we're learning about genetics and how that may lead to cancer and all. What happens is that normal process happens, and the old cells die and new ones come in their place. Sometimes the genes don't reproduce exactly the same. They're not read exactly the same. And then over a period of time, lo and behold, the next thing you know, your cell's not growing in its normal finite path anymore, and it usually starts growing faster than it would normally. And most importantly for cancer, it has the ability to spread. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of uncontrolled cell growth with the potential to spread. That's cancer.
Uncontrolled cell growth, okay. And now we're able to associate, if that's the right word, certain genes with certain cancers?
That's right.
Is that fair to say?
It's accurate and fair, and that just kind of opens up the discussion because, as you know, 1 in 3 Americans will unfortunately be diagnosed with cancer sometime in their life. And so in an effort, you know, we've all heard, you and I went to medical school a few years ago, and, you know, we heard like, well, what causes cancer? Is it smoking? Is it sun? Is it diet? Is it environment? Well, what is it? And all that goes into it. But also, and maybe even more importantly, is the foundation of all that, which is our genes, our DNA, what we're made of, our building blocks, our foundation. And so when the foundation isn't built properly, then these other things come into play, the diet, environment, things like that, that then lead to these cells being read or misinterpreted by our body, that leads to these uncontrolled growths of cells that have the potential to spread, which leads to cancer. So, you know, this country, along with many other countries, embarked on a path in the 1990s that finally ended in, or was officially stamped, approved, and finalized in 2003, where we defined the human genome.
I know, that was amazing.
It's amazing, and the internet had a lot to do with that. And now we know that there's 20 to 25,000 genes in our body. And your genes are different than my genes because you're a woman, I'm a man. Our hair color is different. Our eye color is different. Our body, all that is our DNA. And so you can think of your DNA like the building blocks, and it's like it's a big book, okay? And all the words in the book are the DNA building blocks. And when these genetic abnormalities occur, it's like the words get misspelled.
Right. I love that. I love that metaphor.
And your body can't fix, the spell check doesn't work, you know? And so what happens is these cells start following the new spell check, and that leads to this abnormal growth. It leads to uncontrolled growth, and then you develop a lump, a tumor, as you will, oftentimes. But sometimes these are liquid cancers like leukemias and things like that. And then you have those cells have the ability to spread and cause harm.
So I love that metaphor where you say, you know, you have your entire human genome. My genome is like my big book of who I am. And every chapter defines a different part of, like you said, hair color, sex. And I bet there's a chapter on my risk for cancer.
There is. And what we're learning now today, 2019, we've now identified about 40 chapters, words that are misspelled.
Okay.
And we can say, if you have this misspelled word in your chapter, it doesn't mean automatically you're going to get cancer. It does not mean that. But it means that you're at higher risk to develop cancer if some of these other things occur, like bad diet choices, not leading a healthy lifestyle, alcohol, tobacco, lack of exercise, all these things that we know contribute to the underlying problem, which is the misspelled word.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It makes all the sense in the world. And what's so crazy, because now we have direct-to-consumer advertising from various groups and medical services, which are well-intended. Nevertheless, sometimes in a 60-second spot commercial, you can't explain everything. And you have services such as, I think one of them is called 23andMe, and another one is Ancestry.com, and they come to me and they go, I have this report and it says I have cancer. And so then I have to backpedal. What's the truth behind all of that?
Wow. So I want to try to be very careful how I respond to that. That's a fantastic question, and I think it's something very important for our viewers to understand. So because this problem is so complex, and because today, remember I said there's between 20 and 25,000 genes in our body, and we only have identified really 40 or plus or minus a few specific misspellings that then lead us to have an increased risk of cancer. You can imagine how specific that testing needs to be in order to make sure that we're identifying the misspelling properly. Because if you're just off one letter, you could misidentify the misspelling.
Right.
Okay? So the companies and the process that you alluded to, you can't turn on the TV, you can't turn your smartphone on, you can't listen to the radio, you can't look at anything now where there's not some what we call direct-to-consumer promotion of these. Do you want to know where you came from? Do you want to know what kind of food you're supposed to like? All those kinds of things. Those laboratories that do those kinds of testing, they advertise they're FDA approved, but that does not mean that they are what we call certified laboratories. So as a clinician, as a cancer specialist, and for our genetic counselors and people that are providers that are responsible for giving patients advice about how to act on that information, we do not use that information as what we call actionable information.
Okay.
In other words, if somebody brought me a test from a direct-to-consumer lab and said, oh my gosh, this thing says I have blah, 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 this building block problem, this misspelling, what are you going to do? I'm going to say the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to sit down and do a real genetic counseling, an in-depth history about yourself and your family, and then we're going to validate that potential abnormality because there are false positives and there are false negatives. with a real certified laboratory to see if we have actionable information.
So I'm going to interrupt you because is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So a false positive is when a test comes back and it says you have strep throat, but it's false. It's accidentally testing positive, but it's not really true.
But you don't really have strep
You
throat.
really don't have it.
That's right.
And then a false negative is the one that says you're fine, you don't have it, but in actuality, you do.
They misread the misspelling.
Right.
Yes.
And that's where the skill of the oncologist comes in, because understanding a test, you can't treat a test, but you can take that test and put it into context.
Yes, and you can't treat a test that doesn't come from a laboratory that you have 100% confidence in that they've read the code properly.
Okay, got it. So that all has to be done in your office then.
Well, it has to be done through a healthcare provider that understands where the proper certified labs are to get these tests done.
Right.
They're not on every street corner.
Right. But genes, cancer does run in families.
Absolutely. Yes, cancer does run in families. And certain kinds of cancer have higher degree of probabilities to run in cancers. For instance, one of the first misread gene codes was the so-called BRCA1 and BRCA2, the BRCA genes, and they were identified in the 90s. And so we knew that people that harbored that gene, depending upon what the misspelling was, then they had a certain percentage of risk based on lots of other factors, including their family history, of possibly developing breast cancer, ovary cancer, and other types of cancer. Doesn't mean 100% you're going to get it. It just means, based on your misspelling, this is the percent probability that you might get it if other things line up.
So if I had a friend who had a high incidence of cancer in their family tree, would it be a good idea to get an evaluation and maybe do some surveillance or some preliminary investigation to see whether they're at risk for the development?
Yes, I would advocate that they sit down with a healthcare provider that has an interest and knowledge of these genetic testings. Which ones can be tested for, which ones cannot be tested for, which diseases I'm talking about. And then make an informed decision about, do I really want to know? Because
that's a good point.
there are
Damocles.
Yes, I mean there are certain things for certain types of genetic abnormalities that we can put people into a more, what we call, intensive surveillance. So we know some cancers can be early detected with certain screenings, but we also know there's others that there's no good early screening test. Ovary cancer is a great example. So you got this gene now, this BRCA gene, and it predisposes you to breast and or ovary cancer. I got a pretty good screening test for breast cancer. You got a mammogram, you got ultrasound, you got MRI, you got physical exam, you got all that. But for ovary cancer, we don't really have a lot. So if I'm 28 and somebody in my family had ovary cancer, let's say, and I'm like, ooh, do I have that gene? Do I want to know at 28? I haven't had my first child yet. What am I going to do with that information? And then we get into a whole nother discussion about, can I be discriminated for jobs? Can I be discriminated for health insurance? Can I be discriminated for other insurances? And that's a whole nother discussion. We can have that whenever you like, but those are things, it's not for everybody. And you've got to know, I think it's really important to know the positives and the negatives of being tested or not being tested. I can tell you, we see patients all the time that come in, they're fairly young and they have cancer and they have children in their late teens, early 20s, and like, I want my child tested. I'm like, wait a minute, slow down. What are you going to do with that information?
Right.
Someday, I believe, I don't know if you and I will live to see it, maybe, but someday I believe we will be able to, through some vector, inject into our bodies or somehow get it into our bodies to knock the bad gene out and put the right spelling in and fix it. Now that'll be a big deal.
I know.
That would be a big deal.
We're gonna probably find that we carry it onto the back of some really bad virus.
That's right. That's exactly right. But we'll get it there, and out with the misspelled word and in with the correct spelled word, and life goes on.
It's funny you say that. That's why I became a doctor, because I said, I'm going to find the cure to cancer because it was my neighbor who died from breast cancer.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, so 3 minutes. What do you want to tell the public about the place where this new technology sits in that space of taking care of ourselves? For me, it's always eat healthy and exercise.
Those are two really important issues that, unfortunately, in our culture, we're not real good at.
No.
But what would I say? Don't be afraid of what you don't know. Genetic testing done in the proper set of circumstances by a properly certified laboratory can give you life-saving information. Let me give you a real quick example. Let's say you're 40 years old and it's time for you to go get a screening mammogram. And you go in and you fill out your family history as part of your paperwork to get your mammogram, and all of a sudden some red flags go up. You've had cancer in people in your family, people at a young age, multiple cancers, unusual kinds of cancers, particular some ethnicities. Anyway, you fill out this information and red flags go up. Say, oh, I might be at risk. You sit down, have a brief discussion with a genetics counselor, and you say, I want to know. I'm done having children and I want to know. You have either a blood test or a saliva test. The test is sent off and it comes back and you've got the gene. Now you say, what am I going to do with that? In this example, let's say the patient says, well, you know what? I may keep my breast tissue for now because I tested positive for this BRCA gene, but I don't have a good screening test for my ovaries, so I'm going to have my ovaries removed because I'm finished having children. Physical exam's normal, everything's normal. They go and they have their ovaries removed, and lo and behold, on the pathology, they find ovary cancer. Guess what? That process just saved that person's life.
I know, isn't that cool?
So that's where we're headed. And there are multiple other cancers that we could give examples, but that's what this is all about. That's the take-home message. Don't be afraid of what you don't know. Be very careful how you obtain that information and what methods you use and who does it and when. It's the right test at the right time for the right reason. Be careful about all that, but don't be afraid of it. It could save your life.
That's a great story.
It's true. True.
All right, so you heard it there. Technology and advancements in science are driving better health for all Tennesseans each and every day. It's wild, and I hope I live long enough to see some of it played out because it's going to be so much fun.
It is. It really is.
Dr. Bell, if we need to get a hold of you, would like to see you or anybody in your team, how do we do that?
Well, we're at UT Medical Center at the UT Cancer Institute, and I am blessed to have a whole host of experts in these different fields for the different disease sites. And we also have a genetic counselor, and we have a genetic team. And you call us and you say, hey, I got a question and I may have a problem and I want to sit down and talk to somebody, and we'll help them.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
And that's a wrap.
This episode of Doc Talk is sponsored by the Cancer Institute at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. As the largest single provider of cancer care in the region, the Cancer Institute at the University of Tennessee Medical Center offers a broad spectrum of cancer specialists and services to care for patients and their families. From prevention and early detection to treatment and survivorship, the Cancer Institute is here for you.